Hurry! An alien has issued an alarming warning for 2026. You can't ignore this. The words land like a dropped tool in a quiet workshop, sudden, metallic, impossible to set aside. A clock over Paul's bench freezes on a hand-carved dial. The second hand pauses on the year, 2026, then resumes, but the knot it left in his chest stays. Paul Stevens was not a man who expected the extraordinary. For nearly 50 years he had measured his days by the grain of wood and the rhythm of his hands. He knew the language of splinters and dovetail joints, the soft compliment of sandpaper on oak, the small, stubborn satisfaction of a chair that would not wobble. Retirement to him meant mornings with a mug of chipped mug and evenings with the radio hum of a neighbor's television seeping through the thin walls. It meant a porch where wind suggested the names of the trees. It meant memories of Linda, those bright, stubborn, ordinary years they'd stacked like firewood. After she died, the workshop became both refuge and a kind of confession booth. He talked to the plans as if they were parishioners, and sometimes he half believed they answered. Grief, the slow kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but with a series of small removals, had hollowed him. Her sweater still hung near the back door. The mug with a tiny crack was kept in a cabinet he rarely opened. For 2 years he drifted along the same routes on his walks, his steps taking the outward shape of habit, while inwardly he felt like a man whose map had been burned. Then the signs started, small, insistently ordinary things that behaved like the beginning of a message. At first it was numbers. He would glance at a clock and it would read 11:11. A receipt would show 11:11. The numbers cropped up in accounts, on small envelopes, in the license plate of a delivery truck that always seemed to stop 2 houses down while he was on his porch. They were nothing, they were everything. He heard them like a rhythm under other people's speech. Cardinals came too, brilliant flashes of red on the same windowsill, the same maple branch, as if Linda were finding him in feathered form. He would see one, think of her laugh, and put a hand to his chest as if he could feel her breath. Diane, his neighbor and the unofficial member of his extended family, joked that birds had a way of being rude when they missed her feeder, that cardinals were just show-offs. But to Paul, they were punctuation, a striking comma in a sentence he couldn't yet read. Dreams arrived next, the vivid kind that leave the sleep smoke of them clinging to your shirt when you stand up. They were not the nightmares of grief, no, those had already been walked through, but dreams with strange architecture. Paul would be walking down a familiar street and find himself at the edge of the ocean, though he lived 2 hours from any coastline. He would reach for his wife and find instead a corridor of light. Once, he dreamed of a tuning fork that was too large for his hands. When struck, it hummed a color he didn't have a name for. He mentioned this, lightly, as if speaking a thought aloud might make it cowardly, when he fixed a gate for Diane, or when he sat on the porch with Susan, his daughter, and their conversation flowed like 2 people picking over the bones of a shared childhood. Susan listened without patronizing. She had her own scars. Sarah, his granddaughter, would show him a shaky video of her phone pointing at a brightly lit object streaking across the night sky. She laughed it off as a meteor. Paul kept quiet. The escalation was painless and then immediate. Small oddities. Phone calls that failed and then connected. A neighbor who swore a rooftop garden had been gone a week and then appears in photographs from last year. A streetlight that glowed long after dawn. Layered until the pattern felt like a lattice tightening around a truth. That truth arrived on a Tuesday, in the smell of sawdust and the light of a lamp tilted to sketch a faulty joint. He had stayed late, working on a small rocking chair for Sarah, the kind of project that reminded him that time moves in circles as much as it does straight lines. The house was quiet, his radio was off. A storm had been predicted, and the air smelled like metal and rain. He wiped his palms on his trousers, put the chisel down, and shivered at the draft sliding through the cracked window. The light appeared like a question mark. One moment there was the ordinary glow of the work lamp and the low purple of evening. the next there was a blue-silver radiance that seemed to sit just a breath above the floorboards. It was everywhere and nowhere, like moonlight pooled indoors, like light that had decided to be awake. The smell changed too, an absence of the shop's familiar resin and oil, replaced by a scent Paul could only remember from the attic trunk where Linda had kept old holiday linens. A faint, impossible perfume that was neither floral nor metallic, but suggested both. He stood. The chair remained half-assembled. The radio silence in his ears had weight. His first thought was that someone had left a truck idling outside, a spotlight cutting through the blinds. His second thought was more measured. Someone was playing a trick. Then the air tilted. A shape came through the light as if drawn by a compass toward the room's axis. It was tall, taller than any man he had ever known, but its edges were not hard. There was translucence to it, as if its skin were glass tempered by moonlight. It moved with the easy certainty of something that has never been clumsy. Paul, who had handled heavy oak beams and delicate veneers his whole life, felt a child's awe sting his throat. There was no sound, at least not in the way we usually understand sound. The being's presence translated into a felt pressure at the base of his skull, like the room had turned up the volume on thought itself.
His mouth opened. No words came. Then, without moving its lips, the being spoke into him. The narrator voice takes over here to translate, not to claim literal transcription, but to render what Paul reported receiving. These are not the being's words as recorded by instruments. They are the shape of the message as it landed inside a stunned, grieving, retired carpenter. In the vision transmitted to Paul, you stand at a hinge. The planet is dividing its song. Two currents are forming. The year you mark as 2026 is the time the currents begin to sing apart, where many will hear only their chosen frequency. Paul felt the concept like a draft. Hinge, divide, currents. It was not a prophecy framed in doom. It arrived as cold, clinical observation, and then it unfurled into urgency. The being did not shout. It compressed oceans into syllables. It spoke with the kind of calm that makes you listen because you have no way to look away. You will think of this as choice, the vision transmitted, and it will be. Choice takes shape as repetition. Small acts, habits, are notes in a larger song. The song chooses its listeners. The alien's language folded metaphors into mechanics. It offered the image of two radio stations overlapping on the same dial. A neighbor station broadcasting static, while another plays clear music. Imagine people as receivers. Imagine choices as tuning. Imagine, the being suggested, the world as a room with two doors, both marked but neither impossible to lock. The door is not slammed by thunder. It slides open, the ease of it determined by how often you practice turning the knob. Paul, inside that radiance, understood the meaning, without needing it to be spelled for him. The being's message made him think of the tuning fork in his dreams. It made him think of Linda's laugh ringing in a corridor of light. It made him clutch the edge of his workbench and feel his knuckles go white. This was not a demand to leave everything behind. It was an explanation that trembled with consequence. The being spoke of frequency, said the word as if choosing a simple, honest synonym for conscience. Frequency was a shorthand that would be translated for human minds into something empirical and measured. The visitor offered it as metaphor and as map. It explained that reality, as most humans experience it, is not a single unbroken film, but a weave of strata where one's attention, repetition, and habitual emotional state acts like a warp that chooses which threads are drawn tight. The metaphor was earthy enough for Paul to feel it in his hands. Your feelings are like sanding. Over time, you either smooth a surface or tear it. In the near window, the being transmitted, the warp will separate. We do not decide. The planet enfolds a new tone. Those in thicker grooves will sing a low cadence. Those tuned will sing higher. Both are earth, but the language is change. The cold, clinical clarity of the message was what made it terrifying.
The being did not frame this as cosmic reward or punishment. It framed it as divergence, two coexisting earths distinguished by resonance. Paul's mind supplied the rest. The picture of a town split like a photograph developed in two chemicals, of people reaching for one another with hands that no longer meet because the light between them refracts differently. When the being used the word bifurcation, Paul felt his breath leave him. He had studied enough to know the word in other contexts, a river splitting, a branching of paths. To this being, it seemed a clean, descriptive term for a process that would be felt like loss or like new breath, depending on which side of the seam one found oneself. In the vision, the being suggested that the process begins to visibly divide at your year 2026. The window between the beginning and a near-complete separation spans until about 2033. The narrator paraphrases, careful to mark these as Paul's received images, not as journalistic fact. Between those years, what will be subtle becomes visible. When Paul tried to ask questions, how, why, who, thoughts poured into him without audible speech. He asked whether this was punishment. The being's answer, as Paul would later recount to Diane while washing the beer cans from his bench, was soft with a kind of pity. No punishment, the transmission said. Direction. The planet is maturing. Consciousness differentiates. The why is not a moral ledger. It is resonance. It then gave an image, the planet as a living instrument. Gaia, the story called her, in which different regions respond like strings under varied pressure. In Paul's vision, continents tightened in a sequence of chords, cities hummed, children on playgrounds vibrated in small, bright keys. The being did not preach solutions. It handed him an outline and a metaphor. A tuning fork struck against a bone, the sound sending through the ground and rearranging the dust. And hearts that practice the higher tone, the transmission continued, grow closer to that field. This was the most alarming part. It suggested that the divide was not an external lottery, but an internal tidal change. Selection, it clarified in Paul's mind, is not a cosmic fingerprint. It is the consequence of repeated acts, tiny choices that build a resonance which, in the near window, determines the field you inhabit. Paul's knees trembled. He had never believed himself particularly spiritual. He could not remember when he last read anything that pretended to measure souls. He had been raised to believe in work, in paying attention to the stapled things. And yet the being spoke in a language of habits, of repetition, and the carpenter in him understood the logic. Repeated action makes structure. He had sanded fine over many afternoons to make a plushness that would last. Habits, he had always said to himself, are the slow architecture of life. Then the being offered him a vision, quick, cinematic, and precise. A street he knew from his neighborhood shone in two intercut frames. In one, the hues were washed with a thin gray. Windows were shuttered. People moved with the mechanical politeness of routine. Where there had been laughter, there was distance. In the other frame, the same street sang with color. Neighbors exchanged over porches. Light flowed between houses like a shared conversation. Children ran barefoot. Neither was framed as entirely better or worse, but the differences were stark. The being transmitted that both were earth, but their languages of relationship, health, and attention were different in texture. Paul saw a version of his family in each frame. In the lower frequency frame, Susan and he argued over matters that felt increasingly trivial: property, inheritance, who was more right about Linda's jewelry, and that argument hardened into estrangement. In the higher frequency frame, they argued less and sat with more listening. The tensions that had seemed sharp were softened by comprehension. In the vision, he watched Sarah at a window in one reality and playing in a meadow in the other. In one, she grew distant, in the other, she learned to sing along. You can imagine how that felt, how it pressed against a man's chest. The being did not promise reunion with Linda. It did not say that practicing certain habits would guarantee anything. It only suggested that the texture of living would change, that relationships might be strained or eased by where one found oneself during this bifurcation. Paul's rational mind kept offering counterweights. Maybe this was a dream. Maybe this was a psychotic break brought on by grief and sleep deprivation. Maybe he had inhaled varnish fumes. That he remained coherent enough to notice these possible explanations was itself small evidence that he had not collapsed into madness. He placed his hand on the bench and felt the whisper of wood, and that small physical fact anchored him. The being's presence remained contained in the room's light. It did not touch the wood. It offered no miracles of the pyrotechnic kind. What it offered was information and an image of the near future that rearranged the stakes of everyday life. The visitor's presence felt in a surprising way like a call to craftsmanship. It suggested a return to small, careful acts. Small acts repeated, the transmission said, tilt you toward the field of resonance you most practice. It named habits as the mechanism. Paul, in the silent aftermath, tried to see the being leave. He blinked. The light sliced thin like glass, and then thinned to mist. The being receded, not with a dramatic flare, but as if it were acknowledging a clock's chime and deciding to allow the hour to pass. The workshop returned to its usual air of sawdust and lamp. The scent of Linda's linens lingered faintly on the bench, an impossible residue that made him laugh and cry at the same time.
When he asked Diane about it, she shrugged. "Maybe you moved it without thinking," she offered. But inside him a small, icy question formed. Memory divergence, he thought. He had read the terms in old science fiction novels, but now they had texture. He had no instruments to measure it. He only had the small facts of misplaced items and conversation gaps. The being had also talked about communication failures. Phones dropping on both ends, radio frequencies skipping, the odd sense that messages left in the air were heard by fewer people than before. In the vision, it suggested that technology and infrastructure would not fail universally, but would fail differently across the two fields. Signals carry differently where resonance differs, the being transmitted. Again, it was not framed as doom, but as a technical consequence of a metaphysical contour. Paul listened to these implications and felt the old carpenter logic hum up into his throat. Build a bridge, he thought. Test the supports, check the boards for rot, practice a bit more tenderness in human ways. The being had not left him a manual. It left him a saw and a suggestion. Repetition changes structure. Repetition is how you tune a world toward a frequency. In the days that followed, people reached out, some in curiosity, some in quiet terror. There were the faithful, who wanted to convert the narrative into prophecy and assign reasons and rewards. There were the skeptical, who sought inconsistencies and called him to accounts. Paul answered neither with doctrinal certainty nor with dismissal. He told his story the way a man tells what happened during a storm, not to dramatize, but to mark what the wind did to the roof. Between interviews, he returned to his tools. He sanded. He figured out how much force to put behind a chisel so that it would remove waste without gouging. He found the rhythm of his hands calming. The physicality of wood was an anchor against a world that the being had said would split in two. The work connected him to the idea the alien had transmitted. Repetition holds shape. His apprenticeship had been a long course in that exact logic. He had crafted chairs that would hold people for decades, precisely because he repeated the same small acts until the piece spoke in a particular tone. That evening, as dusk slid into the thicker blue of a near night, Paul sat at his bench and felt the weight of the being's last words settle into him. "There will be signs you can watch for," the being had transmitted in the visiting room's light. "There will be a window to respond. Not all will change. Change is selective." He set his face into the wood and breathed. To the world at large, his story remained one man's account. That was necessary to be honest about. He did not want to become an instrument of fear. He told people that what he had seen was what he had seen. He also told them, with a carpenter's refusal to leave things vague, that small habits could be practiced, nothing miraculous, nothing guaranteed, simply practices to increase the probability of resonance toward the higher tone the being described. And then a small, practical later addition, almost an afterthought in Paul's recounting. The being hinted at practices, simple things, repeated, without naming them fully. It had described constructive acts like turning toward gratitude, spending time outside, forgiving small grievances, serving others, speaking with quiet intention to those who've passed, and rebuilding community. Paul left the list in his head like an outline for a project, a repair plan for the self. The message landed and spread like a stain. On a neighborhood bulletin board, someone pinned a typed sheet. Has anyone else seen, with Paul's phone number at the bottom? People called at all hours. Some asked for evidence. Others whispered about time, about apocalypse, about revolution. Paul, for his part, began keeping a small notebook on his bench. He wrote down times, numbers, birds, feelings, anything that might later be useful for memory. The simple act of recording made him feel steadier. It was what a craftsman does with measurements. He notes, he checks, he corrects. There was a moment when everything about the visitation felt private again, sacred perhaps, but not sacralized. He sat on his porch, leaned a sweater on the chair beside him that no one ever used, and he watched the sun settle behind the maple. A cardinal landed on the rail and looked at him, head cocked. He lifted a hand. He spoke to Linda out loud for the first time in 2 years, not in pleading but in reporting. There was a being, Linda, he said. It told me a thing I didn't know how to keep quiet about. That night, sleep was shallow but full of puzzle pieces that fit in one corner. Visions of 2 streets, the tuning fork, the years pinned like thumbtacks. The next morning, he found a note tucked under his door. We heard. If you want to talk, we're here. It was unsigned. The neighborhood was small but connected. People were quick to assume the role of neighbor and slower to take the role of prophet. Paul folded the note and stuck it in his pocket. The story broadened slowly after that, the way a river widens after 2 small streams meet. For now, the ridge of the plot in which Paul stands is the message itself, and the immediate consequence. 2026 is marked, a bifurcation is announced, and simple habits are suggested as a response. People will react in multiple ways. Some will laugh, some will listen, some will prepare methodically. Paul, for his steadiness, decides to test the being's logic in the thing he knows best, repetition. He chooses to make small changes in his life and observe whether the world responds. But before he can map his first steps, before the list of practices is fully unpacked, or the timeline of external symptoms is given names that the public can tally against, the story changes tone. News arrives, non-sensational, factual on the surface, but odd in detail. A local postmistress mentions a customer who swore a photograph of a festival had been different yesterday than it was today. A radio host laughs on air about memory glitches, and then, later, apologizes for sounding flippant. Paul reads these small notes like a man checking a blueprint. Each discrepancy is a rivet in the being's story. He knows not to panic. The being did not tell him to panic. But the human heart is not inclined to live in a state of calm calculation when the calendar points out a hinge. The real test of the narrative, he thinks, will not be in headlines, but in the texture of relationships. Whether people start referring to the same memories and finding that the facts they once shared are no longer wholly shared. It is here, just as Paul begins to make his first tentative commitments to change, that the narrative pauses, and the question hangs. Will the small acts he intends to practice hold against the tide the being has described?
Will a man who has lived with the grain of wood in his hands be able to retune himself before the clock hits the year the being emphasized? The blue-silver light of the visitation has receded for now, but its impression and urgency shaped by hope remains. He turns over the idea in his mind like a workpiece, feeling for cracks, listening to the faint resonance that might be changed by the simple, repeated friction of daily life. If you have ever watched a woodworker check the balance of a plane, you know how quiet attention feels. That is what Paul does then. He begins to test the plane of his life. He notes the frequency of his thoughts. He notices how often he says why and how often he says thank you. He walks to the maple where cardinals gather and counts how many times one chooses the same branch. These are small concessions to the visitor's metaphor. At this point, if you find yourself leaning in with a certain restless curiosity, if the idea that 2026 could be a hinge shakes you even slightly, there is a simple request. Subscribe and stay with this account. There will be a step-by-step unpacking of what the being sketched and a practical guide to simple, repeatable choices that Paul tries as experiments. You will not be sold certainty. You will be offered a pattern and a witness. If you are skeptical, keep watching. Skepticism is a healthy companion in any story with high stakes. If you are anxious, anchor yourself in ordinary acts. Fix a chair leg, write down a name, call someone you love. But the main narrative keeps moving. In the days following the visitation, Paul's life begins to feel like a shop in which a new project has been assigned. Not a table or a chair, but an interior retuning. He is given the outline of practices, left unnamed for the moment, and he begins to test their edges. He tells Diane that he is trying something, and she smiles like someone who knows too well that experiments are how people heal. He writes partial lists. He reads passages from an old book Linda loved, aloud, to see if the cadence of his voice changes the feeling in his chest. He walks more slowly, paying attention to the way the maple leaves catch the light. He calls Susan more often, not to solve anything, but to be present. Each small repetition is an experiment against the being's claim that repetition becomes the warp. The tension in the story is now twofold. On one hand, there is the outer clock, 2026 presses visible in the visitor's vision. On the other, there is the inner test. Will repetition change the grain of his life enough that, should a bifurcation become visible, his resonance attunes toward the field the being described? He does not have proof. He only has practice. And so the scene closes on a man at his bench, hands moving with a renewed slowness, the radio off, the lamp lit, a notebook of peculiar, ordinary observations beside him. He is listening, both to the world and to the memory of the being's calm voice. Somewhere, in a few years' time, on calendars and in conversations, an axis will pivot. For now, there is work to be done, and the work is crafted in small, repeated acts that a carpenter knows how to do. Plan, strike, sand, adjust, repeat. Paul's first weeks of practice were small and stubbornly ordinary, the kind of adjustments a carpenter could believe in. Measurable, repeatable, and quietly demanding. He did not sweep his life clean of doubt. He merely introduced a new set of motions to see what answered. The being had said habits were the warp. Paul decided to pick 3 threads and see how the cloth changed. First came gratitude. He set an alarm for before dawn and sat on the porch with the chipped mug Linda had once scorned for being too small. For 5 minutes he rehearsed names and small mercies aloud. Linda's laugh, the hinge he'd finally mended on the neighbor's fence, the cardinal that had visited last summer. He did not try to make his grief disappear. Instead, he learned to let gratitude and memory sit together like 2 hands holding a plank steady while he measured. The early cold air sharpened the ritual. Some mornings the words felt hollow. Some mornings they lodged in his chest like kindling. Over time, the practice changed the cadence of his day. He would find himself saying thank you in the middle of sanding, or pausing to notice the smell of sawdust like a prayer. Second, he practiced presence in work, the act of meditation the being had mentioned as conscious service. It meant something simple. When he planned to glue a joint, he glues it with full attention. He put away the radio and learned the subtle voices of his tools. He timed himself to breathe in 4 counts as he measured and to breathe out 4 counts as he filed. The workbench became a gym for attention. When his hands were engaged, his mind stopped circling fear and fell into rhythm. Those hours of attention were short, 30 minutes, 90 minutes, sometimes 3. Never an ascetic retreat, just the same 5 or 10 motions done with a steady mind. Nature time came third. The being had not asked him to live in the woods, only to reintroduce himself to the living landscape. Paul chose a 20-minute walk, sometimes to the maple by his house, sometimes to a small park where the grass still smelled like evening. He deliberately removed his watch. If he saw a cardinal, he let the sight remain without explaining it. If the wind shifted, he followed it with his eyes. Often, he would return with sticks tucked into his jacket as if he had been given small accidental gifts. Those first 3 practices were scaffolding. They weren't exotic. They were, as the being had suggested, exercises of frequency. Gratitude loosened constriction. Presence in work steadied the nervous system. Nature tuned the body to cycles other than the pulse of screens and deadlines. Together, they felt like a new set of tools. No guarantee, but honest instruments. When he added forgiveness as a daily discipline, the work became more personal. The being's emphasis on forgiveness was not pious, it was practical. Paul was asked to take 5 minutes each evening and name one thing he or someone else had done that day, then to imagine loosening whatever tightened inside him because of it. For him, forgiveness began with himself, admitting not merely the absence of perfect action, but the fatigue that made him forget to call, the impatience that made him answer sharply. He learned to speak aloud, "I forgive myself for," and then to sit with the somatic sense of that sentence. At first, the feelings stayed dull, like a tool not yet worn in. Later, they became more elastic. He learned to apologize to Susan for small slights with a steadier voice, and she, in turn, began to soften. The being had not promised reconciliation, but it had suggested that the emotional load of clutching grudges might shift a person's resonance. Paul found that letting go of small resentments made him available for larger presence. Simple service, an act a day, was the being's next hammer. The being had described service not as grand sacrifice, but as the calibration of attention toward another's need in small ways. Paul started with Diane's loose fence board and finished with a neighbor's grocery run. Many mornings he would peer out his window and choose one small errand to do without being asked. Bringing in a newspaper left on the lawn for a widower down the block, fixing a squeaky hinge for a mother of 3, taking Sarah's trash cans out on a rainy Monday without comment. The act did not have to be dramatic. It only had to be consistent. Over the weeks, he found the rhythm of giving to be its own reward. The feelings were not showy, but they nurtured a softening in him that other people noticed. Diane began to bring extra cookies when she came over. Neighbors began to check in on him in a way that felt like woven thread rather than a sudden rope. The practice of inner dialogue, speaking to guides, to memory, to the dead in a structured way, was the one that startled him most. The being's instruction had been oddly formal. Converse with those you loved for 5 minutes each day as if they were present, not to summon, but to consult. Paul began by sitting in Linda's old chair and reading aloud one paragraph from the book she loved. Then he would speak into the dim, "What would you do today?" He did not expect an answer in words. Instead, he experienced images. Linda's hands arranging napkins at a family dinner, a joke she told about burnt toast. Sometimes he felt a warmth like teak rubbing against oak. Other times, nothing came. Gradually, the practice shaped his solitude into a discipline. He did not claim proof of contact. He described it as a change in the quality of presence. He found himself less lonely by the end of these rituals, and he slept with fewer jagged awakenings. Finally, community. The being had emphasized that no tuning is meant only for one set of ears. Resonance is social. Paul began to gather a circle, informal, practical, and not bound to doctrine. Diane invited 3 neighbors to his porch on a Sunday. They sat, awkward at first, and Paul spoke about a rocking chair, about cardinals, about the tuning fork he had seen in dreams. People were candid. One man was amused, another deeply skeptical. A woman confessed she'd been having odd numbers appear on the clock. They set, tentatively, a practice to check in on one neighbor daily, to rotate meals for the elderly, to meet once a week and do 5 minutes of gratitude aloud. The circle was not designed as a cult or a refuge. It was a mutual aid network practiced like a craft circle, simple routines that built a shared pattern of attention. The being had not issued a curriculum with graded levels and certificates. It had described simple choices and their repetition: gratitude, presence in work, nature time, forgiveness, service, inner conversation, community. Paul kept them in that order, using each new habit to deepen the others. Over months, he could show tangible changes. He slept with fewer sudden wakings. He could look at a photograph of Linda without the double pull of pain and denial. Instead, he felt the memory like a board smoothed and oiled. He noticed fewer moments where his hands shook when he answered a difficult phone call. He began to notice synchronicities with a new curiosity. Numbers repeated less like taunts and more like punctuation. 1111 on a receipt was not always an omen. Sometimes it was a marker he used to notice his breath. If you want the short, practical 30-day checklist of these 7 practices, the daily steps, the little prompts Paul used to keep momentum, you can download the free ebook in the pinned comment. It lays out a simple calendar you can try. Nothing mandatory, no promises, just a companion for daily work. The mid-video invitation is gentle and optional, an aid for someone who wants a concise way to try the practices themselves. After he began the practices with intention, the world did what the being's vision suggested. Subtle tests arrived. They were not dramatic, headline-grabbing events. They were shifts in texture that either confirmed the shape of the message or invited more careful observation. Paul started to catalog these external signs, both to watch for patterns and to keep himself anchored in pragmatic curiosity rather than fear. He recorded them in his notebook with exacting detail. The being had said the window for visible divergence began in 2026 and extended during a transition period to around 2033. Between those years, subtle differences might accumulate into recognizably different realities. Paul created a list of symptoms he was told to observe and to describe them in his own words when they occurred. The first was memory divergence. This was not simple forgetfulness. It was the eerie experience of 2 reliable witnesses recalling the same event differently in ways that could not easily be explained by time or stress. Paul noted a photograph on the mantel that he remembered being taken in winter. Susan insisted it had been taken in summer. A neighbor remembered a block party that Paul could find no record of. These were not malicious differences. They were dissonances, cracks in consensus memory that, if ignored, could widen into misalignments of daily life. Second, disappearance or reassignment of objects, things that had been in one place and then, without clear cause, were not. Paul lost a letter he'd left on the kitchen table. Susan found it 3 days later in a book she swore she hadn't opened. The being had suggested this would happen in scattered and inconsistent ways. It was not mass vanishing, it was a sort of slippage of particulars. Third, communication failure. Phones dropping, texts not delivering, calls failing at odd moments and then working again minutes later. Paul experienced a call to Diane that kept cutting out when he tried to mention the word bifurcation, but connected perfectly when they spoke of the fence. He learned to keep simple, patient backups, leave physical notes, keep a paper list of emergency numbers, and do not rely wholly on one channel. Fourth, family splits. Less dramatic than civil war and more intimate. Small arguments that hardened into distance because 2 people no longer shared the same anchor memories or because one person's emotional tone shifted in a way the other could not follow. Susan and Paul had a disagreement about Linda's jewelry. In Paul's lower frequency vision, it grew into estrangement. In the higher frequency vision, it dissipated. The being did not claim to control outcomes. It only suggested the pattern and its human stakes. Fifth, geography losing relevance in everyday life. This sounded odd until Paul noticed his sister in another county who insisted she had lived in a different house the whole of her childhood. Maps and addresses in the vision had shifted in small local ways. In practice, it meant more reliance on inner orientation and on human relationships than on official paperwork or geography when people's histories no longer matched. Sixth, technical divergence. The being had said infrastructure would behave differently across fields, technology misaligning in subtle ways, not wholesale collapse. Paul saw radios that refused to tune to a station only in certain neighborhoods, GPS directions that looped for some and not others. It was chaotic at first, and then people learned to carry redundant systems, paper maps, printed contacts, analog backups. Seventh, clarity for those who practice. The being, in Paul's translation, suggested that for people actively cultivating the higher tone, certain perceptions would sharpen. A stronger sense of presence, an increased frequency of meaningful coincidences, an easier access to calm under pressure. It did not promise miracles. It promised a subjective clarity, an internal change that made deciding and acting less fraught. Paul framed each of these not as incontrovertible signs, but as watchworthy patterns. He shared them with the circle so they could compare notes without panic. The group's meetings became a kind of observatory, a space to talk through discrepancies, to compare dates, to cross-check photographs. They kept making lists and rehearsing small, grounded responses. If a call dropped, check the landline. If memories diverge, bring paper evidence and approach the conversation with curiosity rather than accusation. The social reaction to these observations was not uniform. There were local podcasts and skeptics who argued that memory divergence was nothing but faulty recall or a rise in online misinformation. There were also neighbors who reported odd numbers and cardinals with a softness in their voices, and others who found the whole conversation ridiculous. Paul learned quickly to hold both responses without taking either as ultimate truth. He had been given not a law, but a set of observations and a set of efforts that felt coherent enough to him to try. Crucially, Paul's life did not erupt into apocalyptic breakage. Instead, small doors opened. Susan, who had been reserved about the visitation at first, began to sit longer on the porch when she came to visit. She started attending the weekly circle not because she had been convinced about the alien's message, but because she liked the practice of 5 minutes of gratitude aloud.
Sarah, his granddaughter, who had always been practical to a fault, began bringing Paul recordings she made of birds near her apartment. She told him one evening she had been thinking of him when a cardinal appeared on her fire escape, a small thread of continuity that made both of them smile. On a particularly crisp autumn morning, Paul went into town to buy nails. He half expected to overhear some new rumor about his story. Instead, the clerk at the hardware store handed him a folded note without comment. "Working tomorrow? Mrs. Adler could use your help. She keeps saying the nightlight is wrong again." It was anonymous and kind. These small acts of mutual aid were the thing he valued most. Evidence not of cosmic favor, but of neighborliness restored. As spring approached, the year before 2026, the patterns Paul tracked began to attract a different kind of attention. A journalist from a regional paper asked to visit the workshop. Paul agreed, anxious but steady. He told his account plainly, the visitation, the being's message, the 7 practices. The journalist asked questions about evidence, about mental health, about the possibility of hoax. Paul answered as frankly as he could. He had no laboratory proof, only a consistent inner impression and small external patterns that he was trying to catalog. The article that followed treated him as a serious witness rather than a prophet, and that nuance helped his story find a wider audience that included skeptics and seekers. Meanwhile, the being's vision that included rough percentages filtered back through Paul's retelling. The transmission had suggested, in Paul's words, approximate figures, small proportions of people naturally resonating with the higher tone, larger proportions not yet tuned. Paul always prefaced any mention of numbers with the same care. This is how it came in the vision. Perhaps 10 to 15% tuned initially, perhaps 80 to 85% needing work. He emphasized again and again that these were images received, not measured facts. For some listeners, those numbers felt like too much certainty. For others, they were just a way to frame the magnitude of attention the being recommended. The months braided into ritual. The 7 practices fit into a loose daily structure. 5 minutes of gratitude at dawn, an hour of attentive work or ritualized present labor mid-morning, a 20-minute walk in the afternoon, 5 minutes of forgiveness each evening, 1 small act of service sometime during the day, a short inner dialogue before bed, weekly community meetings on Sundays. The pattern was flexible, the purpose was repetition. Paul felt lighter. He still missed Linda with a blunt physical ache, especially in evenings. But the ache now was interleaved with other textures, curiosity, small joy, a kind of readiness. As 2026 edged closer, public chatter increased and the group in Paul's neighborhood expanded, though it never became a mass movement. People used different languages to describe the same phenomena. Some spoke of attunement, others of psychological practices. Some framed it as literal metaphysics. At a city council meeting, a worried man asked if the city should declare an emergency. The council politely declined and suggested focusing on community resilience in ways that were useful for any kind of local stress. Soup kitchens, buddy systems, and better local phone trees. That pragmatic pivot appealed to Paul. It avoided mania and focused on what good neighbors do in difficult weather. Not all signs were friendly. Paul filed one of the stranger reports in his notebook. A woman from down the road called to say that the photograph she remembered of a graduation had a boy in it that no one else recalled. She asked if Paul had seen it before. He had not. 2 days later, she was less upset and more curious. An older woman in the circle brought her a box of family albums and helped her compare details. The practice of comparison, of shared patience and evidence gathering, deflated some fears and clarified others. Many of the oddities could not be resolved, but working through them together lowered the temperature of individual panic. Then, as the calendar quietly slid toward the marked year, Paul felt the old tension rise anew. 2026 was not a midnight hour for him. It was a threshold. He likened it to the last plane of sanding before varnish. The board could take one more careful smoothing, or it could be left raw and expected to hold. He increased the discipline of his practices in a way that felt not frantic but exacting. He invited Susan to sit with him in the workshop after dinner and taught her the way he measured with a marking gauge. He taught Sarah how to plane a board without tearing the grain. These were small exchanges of skill that anchored conversations and rebuilt in quiet ways relational fabrics. A few weeks before the year, he had the clearest synchronicity since the visitation. At dawn, a cardinal landed on his porch railing and tapped, then flew away. On the railing, near where the bird had sat, was a scrap of paper with a single, neat number, 2026, written by an unknown hand. No one claimed it. Susan joked that perhaps some well-meaning neighbor was reminding them to be present. Paul folded the slip into his notebook like a thumbtack and felt the old ring of urgency burn without melting into panic. The being's vision had warned of diverging communication, phones failing, signals dropping. Paul prepared simple redundancies, printed lists of contacts, hard copies of important documents in a drawer, a central meeting place in the park with a red bench that everyone agreed to reach should systems fail. None of these measures were dramatic. They were ordinary and sensible. They also felt like a carpenter's approach to a problem. Strengthen the joints, add a backup brace, test the load. When 2026 arrived, a strange hush seemed to pass through the town.
There were no cinematic flares on the horizon. There were, however, small episodes that fit the patterns Paul had cataloged. A few people reported an evening when phone signals cut out in a swath of neighborhoods and then returned an hour later. A church choir member noted that the hymn they had sung that day had words anyone could sing easily. And yet, when recounting the event afterward, a few parishioners remembered different verses. In a small but noticeable way, conversations included caveats now. I remember it this way, but you might remember it differently. The vocabulary shifted from certainty to curiosity in a number of households. Importantly, the bifurcation did not manifest as a simple binary flip. For many, including Paul, it was incremental. He found himself more often in moments of clear connection. A long, easy conversation with Susan in which practical matters were decided with less friction. A child in the neighborhood bringing him a painted rock and the paint matching colors Linda had loved. At the same time, he heard accounts of neighbors who felt increasingly isolated from family members whose perceptions had hardened in other directions. The being had been clear that divergence could feel like loss. It did not absolve him of grief, but it gave him a framework to respond with skill rather than panic. One of the harshest tests came when an old friend, someone Paul had known since his apprenticeship, stopped answering the calls that had been a weekly rhythm for decades. The friend, who had been prone to quiet ways, began to hold positions that surprised Paul. The two found themselves speaking around each other more and more. Paul mourned the loss as any man would, but he also brought the practice of forgiveness and curiosity forward. He wrote a note he did not deliver. I remember when we split a joint and vowed to always check the grain together. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. He didn't demand reply, he left space and continued his daily practices. Across these months, the being's promised clarity for practitioners seemed to grow in modest ways. Simple decisions that had once knotted Paul's chest loosened. The practice of presence made him less likely to spiral into catastrophic thoughts. He could, with more ease, choose to respond rather than react. Other members of the circle reported similar small shifts. Fewer sleepless nights, a steadier capacity to hold a hard conversation without inflaming it. None of this proved the vision's metaphysics, it only argued for the pragmatics of simple habits in the face of social disarray. Publicly, discussions about two Earths took many forms: philosophical, theological, scientific. Some voices insisted the language was metaphor and urged focusing on community resilience. Others leaned into literal interpretations. Paul remained careful. He always framed the story as, "This is what came to me." He encouraged practical preparation. Brake pads, supply checklists, neighbor buddies, not as paranoia, but as good civic practice acceptable to many outcomes. The months after 2026 were a patchwork. Some neighborhoods reported an uptick in divergent symptoms. Others reported relative calm and even surprising closeness among residents who had intentionally engaged in practices of attention. Paul saw in his own life what the being had transmitted. Repetition changes structure. He did not claim causality in a scientifically rigorous sense. He claimed correlation and personal transformation. By 2028, the longer window the being spoke of, 2026 to 2033, was in motion. Some patterns had become steady, others remained sporadic. The circle had matured into a modest community resource. They ran an informal helpline for neighbors who found conversations turning strange. They hosted a monthly workshop on keeping records and managing contradictory memories with patients. And they maintained a tent at the farmer's market where anyone could come and learn the 7 simple practices for free. These were practical acts, carried out with no pretense of guaranteeing outcomes. They were, at worst, useful community building. At best, small levers of change in the texture of daily life. Paul's personal arc completed with neither rapture nor ruin, but with a quieter resolution. He learned to find Linda in ordinary things without being undone. He and Susan rebuilt a relationship that, while not free of past friction, now included long, patient conversations about memory and inheritance that were practical rather than reactive. Sarah, moved by the small community projects, began volunteering at a local clinic and called him to say she found that noticing gratitude and patience changed how they spoke to her. Diane and others learned carpentry basics on Paul's bench. Some small projects, benches for the park, repaired swings, became shared symbols of care. In public circles, Paul began to speak less about cosmic certainties and more about craft. He described the practices as tools anyone might use to live with more steadiness regardless of the ultimate metaphysical status of the bifurcation. When viewers or listeners asked whether his practices had guaranteed him access to some higher frequency reality, he answered with care and the same humility that had guided his account from the beginning. "I cannot promise outcomes," he would say. "I can only tell what I practice and how I feel. The work has given me more ease and more presence. Whether that aligns me with a different field is not something I can prove." That sentence, "I cannot promise outcomes," was his anchor. It kept the community from tipping into certitude and offered an ethical posture to hope without coercion. It was also honest. Paul never claimed that the being had promised reunions. He never said performing practices would bring Linda back. What he did claim, and what he experienced, was a tangible shifting. Fewer jagged nights, more unforced laughter with Susan, a deeper capacity to accept the world's ambiguity. The being's presence in his life receded after those first dramatic months. It was not gone. It had left a residual cadence, an invitation to steady work. Paul learned to attend to life as one attends to a well-made chair. Measure, sand, fit, repeat. He kept the notebook on the bench. He kept an extra set of printed contacts in the drawer. He kept a small stack of Linda's favorite book on the shelf and read a paragraph aloud now and then without expectation. In quiet moments, he thought about those who had been swept into fear or zeal. He worried about people who might use urgency to coerce action. He tried, when he could, to diffuse panic and to model the being's emphasis on craft rather than spectacle. He spoke at community meetings about practical resilience, the kind that helps in any kind of systemic stress. Checklists for emergencies, rotating neighbor watch schedules, regular meetings that allow conversation in which people can be heard without being judged. This was the kind of communal architecture he favored, a civic scaffolding that supports both skeptical and believing neighbors. As the years moved toward 2033, the near-complete separation the being had spoken of had its own texture. For some, divergence tightened into clearer patterns. For others, intentional practices and community resilience mitigated the worst friction. The world did not split like a stage curtain into two wholly discrete planes. It shifted more like wood quarter sawn under different light. Certain grains became visible to some and invisible to others. For people who had intentionally cultivated presence and community, choices about how to live and whom to keep close became clearer. For those who retreated into rigid certainties or into fear, life became more brittle. Paul never lost his capacity for wonder. He still kept the carved tuning fork he had made in the early days. An imperfect piece of metal struck and filed until it hummed in a tone that to him was comforting. On mornings he felt overwhelmed, he would strike it and listen to the overtones. The sound did not change external facts, but it changed his posture. It taught him again the being's lesson. Small, repeated acts change the material they act upon. As the final temporal anchor approached, 2033, the near-complete separation the being had spoken of had its own texture. For some, divergence tightened into clearer patterns. For others, intentional practices and community resilience mitigated the worst friction. The world did not split like a stage curtain into two wholly discrete planes. It shifted more like wood quarter sawn under different light. Certain grains became visible to some and invisible to others. For people who had intentionally cultivated presence and community, choices about how to live and whom to keep close became clearer. For those who retreated into rigid certainties or into fear, life became more brittle. Paul never lost his capacity for wonder. He still kept the carved tuning fork he had made in the early days, an imperfect piece of metal struck and filed until it hummed in a tone that, to him, was comforting. On mornings he felt overwhelmed, he would strike it and listen to the overtones. The sound did not change external facts, but it changed his posture. It taught him again the being's lesson. Small, repeated acts change the material they act upon. As the final temporal anchor approached, 2033, Paul reflected on what it meant to live with an alien's alarming warning that had pushed him toward a regimen of ordinary work. The urgency the title promised was real. It was wired to a year. But the alarm had not been in order to flee or to buy arms. It was an invitation to return to small, steady practices that could be done by anyone. 5 minutes of gratitude, attentive work, time in nature, daily forgiveness, simple service, inner conversation, and the building of community.
The alien's warning, in Paul's hands, became a call to craft a life with attention and care. The closing image of Paul's ark is not cinematic fireworks, but an ordinary bench under a lamp, a notebook open, a mug warmed by tea, and a bird, cardinal, perched on the railing, head cocked the way it always had been. He is sanding a small oak chair, smoothing the last plane strokes before the final finish. The clock on his bench, hand-carved years ago, ticks forward. He listens, as he learned to listen, to the grain of the wood and to the small voice inside him that has learned to be both vigilant and kind. If you feel a tug hearing his story, an urge to try a practice or to prepare practically, you can find the free 30-day checklist in the pinned comment. It's a small tool to begin experiments in daily attention, nothing more and nothing less. If you want guided support beyond that, there is a modest directory of community circles and optional consultations in the description. They are offered as resources, not as obligations. Choose what helps you stay steady. Paul's final counsel, when people asked him what to do with the sense of urgency, was simple and human. Tend what is in front of you. Name what you're grateful for. Fix what you can. Forgive where possible. Speak aloud to the ones you love. Give a small kindness without announcement. Walk in the green for a while each day, and find at least one person to join you in the practice. He would repeat, with a craftsman's plainness, that repetition does the shaping. That was the being's message distilled into a life. Small acts make the architecture of days. Hurry, the title reads, an urgency that matters because a year was pinned on a calendar. But hurry, Paul learned, need not mean panic. It can mean the careful application of attention. It can mean picking up a plane and smoothing a surface one pass at a time. The clock will keep its hours. What matters is what you do with the minutes you are given.